Why did they become so blessed? Why was it that these people were given all the blessings that other nations didn't get? Well, in Exodus 19:6, God had picked them. He said, you're a nation of priests. You're a nation that is specially chosen by me. And that's true. God blessed them and gave them things that no other nation had given. God had promised Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12 that he would make of them a great nation, that he would give the land to them they saw, and that all nations would be blessed through them. The first blessing, becoming a great nation, took place in Exodus 12 when perhaps some 2 million people got ready to head out of Egypt and head into the desert and eventually go into the promised land. The second promise, that of having the possession of the land, we see having been fulfilled in Judges 11:23, where it says that God gave them the land. And you see they lost it. They turned to idolatry. God had given them so many things. They were led out of the captivity and given independence, as it were. And yet, over the years, as they became soft, and as they became very self-centered, and as they became very convinced that they knew more than God, they lost it. And they went into either Assyrian captivity for the north or to Babylonian captivity for the south. It can happen to any people if we simply choose to turn our back on where all good things came from. Number one, they let God guide them in good times and bad. We remember in the wilderness they grumbled against Moses, didn't they? We remember they even tried to overthrow his leadership at one time. But at least they stayed together when they were sending spies into the land. The spies came back and all but 2 of them gave a bad report. Why, they're giants in the land. We can't possibly overcome them. But Joshua and Caleb says, oh, yes, we can. And so, even though they were punished by having to wander in the wilderness for an additional 38 years, making a total of 40 years, at least that new generation got into the promised land. One generation had sacrificed, but another received the rewards. Secondly, when their enemies threatened, they did not give in, but continued forward. Sometimes people have this desire to throw in the towel. Well, it's obvious we can't do very much because we just don't have the ability. Now, what if Moses had thought that? Do you remember when the Amalekites were attacking and Moses was holding up his staff? Aaron on one hand, Hur on the other hand. And as Moses got tired and his hands came down, the battle went against them. But as his staff went up, the battle went according to God's plan. So it is when we let God lift up our hands, we can overcome our enemies. Third, they did not expect something for nothing. Now at first, I'm sure they got used to that manna that dropped from heaven. It came every day, didn't it? Except, of course, on the Sabbath day, where they had to gather a special amount on the day before the Sabbath so they wouldn't have to gather it on the Sabbath day. But for 40 years, they had manna given to them. But still, they had to do something. God expected them to have the tabernacle, the Levitical priesthood. God expected certain sacrifices, and they had a number of sacrifices they had to give. Everyone did their share. No, they did not expect something for nothing. When God's people or a nation expect something for nothing, then they're in big trouble because they know that's exactly what they're going to get. By giving nothing, they're going to get nothing. Also, they did not listen to inexperienced and agenda-laden people who had selfish motives in mind. Do you remember Dathan, for example? Dathan wanted to lead a revolt against Moses. But we remember that there was on one occasion when the sons of Korah and others had revolted against Moses. We remember an occasion of an earthquake where the earth just swallowed up several people, showing that Moses' leadership was good and theirs was not. You remember that Aaron and Miriam even decided they wanted the glory. And in Numbers, it says that Moses was the meekest man upon the face of the earth. And when they said, why shouldn't we get some of the leadership capacity? Then Moses prostrated himself to the earth. And God told these people, no, this is the man I've chosen. This is the man I'm going to have lead us. When we choose those who are inexperienced and have their own agenda, then we find that the selfish motives often will lead us in the wrong direction. Also, we notice that they did not lay their troubles at the foot of one person exclusively. It's easy to blame one person for all your troubles, isn't it? Whether it be troubles that we have morally or economically, or whether it's troubles we have in the church, or whether it's troubles we have getting along with our friends and neighbors or with our family. It's easy to do because one man is a convenient target. Moses was a convenient target, was he not? They murmured and grumbled against Moses continually. And I'm sure that a lesser man would have said, I can't put up with this anymore, Lord. But God strengthened Moses and gave him that special vigor. We read a few moments ago in Deuteronomy 34 that when he died, it said that his eye was not dim, verse 7, and his natural force had not abated. God gave Moses a special strength for a special need. And when he was 120 years old, here he is ready to lead the children of Israel right up to the brink of the promised land. He didn't get to go in, but he had done all that God expected him to do. Sacrifice was expected of all people. No one took away from the successful the means of production to cripple the well-being of everyone else. You see, that's why there were tithes. There were peace offerings, there were oblations, there were sacrifice for sin trespass offerings, and then there were the sacrifices that you brought of what you had, the best of your field. You could not bring the worst and give the worst. In fact, if you had a good lamb, you had to give a good lamb. If you gave a bad lamb, God was not pleased. In Malachi, we learned that people were bringing in the lame to the halt and the blind to offer to God, and God was not pleased. And the question is, will a man rob God? No, success was expected. Sacrifice was expected of all people. Everyone didn't simply stand with their hand out saying, give me something for nothing. That was not the way that people survived in the wilderness. And when they got to the promised land, each tribe had to stand and fight for themselves, didn't they? When Saul called the people together, he called them from all the tribes. And those that did not respect his wishes, Saul dealt with in a very punitive fashion. Also, they did not listen only to those who had bad advice or who hated God's leaders with selfish underlying motives. What if they'd listened to Dathan? What if they'd listened to the sons of Korah? What if they had listened to the people that led them into whoredom in Numbers 25 among the Moabites? What if they had listened to those people? Then God's people would have been wiped out in the desert. When we don't listen to good advice, and when we're too ignorant to know that good advice is being given, then we soon find ourselves on the short end of the stick. God's people need to read the Bible and find out what the truth is, so that we do the things that God wants us to do. And lastly, well-tested and known to work dependence on God's plan was not substitute for promises that sounded too good to be true. Something for everyone with no one giving for the good of all. Oh, we're going to get into the promised land, but nobody's going to have to fight. Why, 2 or 3 of you can do it. Why, we can just disarm you all, and the people of the lands will let us come in. The Hivites, the Girgashites, the Perizzites, they won't oppose us. We don't need to sharpen our swords. We don't need to have our shields ready. Why, all we have to do is just cut back our forces and we'll be fine. God will just take care of us because these people want our goodwill. Oh, they knew better. They had to be ready. And God said, here's what you do. When you go in, you wipe out the Hivites and Perizzites and Girgashites and Amorites. You do my will because they've sinned against me. Only when we do exactly what God says are we going to find ourselves being blessed. Is there anything we can learn from Mount Nebo? Yes, I think there is. There were struggles, but Moses got them there. Secondly, Israel's enemies did not destroy them because they had the good sense not to assume only change for change's sake was good policy. It's got to be according to what God wants. Third, the promised land was for those who earned it. It was not for the faithless who died in the wilderness. Those fighting men died in the wilderness except for Joshua and except for Caleb because they did exactly what God told them. Fourth, while Moses himself had problems, he at least led them to the brink of Jordan and turned it over to Joshua, not to the false prophets of Baal. When we listen to the false prophets that tell us something is good when we know it's not, we know then that our time is short and our blessings are going to be curtailed. Number 5, they did not let partisan wrangling blind them to a greater good. And I'm glad that was the case, that they saw that the need to be united and go forward was more important than fighting among themselves. 6, they did not forget their past history. They remembered how God had led them through this tragedy and that one and this one and this one. And they were reminded of it in Deuteronomy over and over and over again. Moses went through their history and told them, do you remember when we did this and this? And he said, choose you this day whom you will serve. Aren't we glad that Moses and Joshua chose Jehovah? And lastly, they did not ignore the laws of God, which seemed minor for a so-called greater good. Which mountaintop will it be for us today? Choose you this day whom you will serve.